Greetings, beautiful people. Welcome to this episode of Spirit in the Material World, your audible Eat, Pray, Love remix with Old Bay, shea butter, and sandalwood. I'm your host, Janna Zinzi, also known as Jazz, and it is my honor and pleasure to welcome Emily Williams to the show today. She is a highly respected social justice leader with a background in global advocacy and higher education. There's so much more I could say about her brilliance and how fierce Emily is in the world, but we'll leave it at that. We'll get there. Um, and also, she is the best friend of Taylor Casey, a beautiful Black trans youth advocate who disappeared in the Bahamas last year. We are going to have a discussion about this case and what she's learned and what travelers and people who love travelers should know about dealing with a loved one's disappearance abroad. Thank you so much for being here, Emily.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Janna.
Of course, of course. This is a really important conversation that we've been wanting to have together and wanting to, bring you on the show to share a bit about this. Taylor's case did get, because of, you and the family's diligence and persistence, it did get some press attention. But can you share with the listeners more about what happened with Taylor?
Yeah, and thanks again for really amplifying Taylor's story, because Taylor disappeared in June of last year. Taylor was at the Sivananda Ashram Yoga Retreat Center in Paradise Island, Bahamas, for a teacher training in June of last year, in June of 2024, and was reported missing. They said that Taylor had not shown up for class and for an entire day, and then they didn't see her the next morning, and so then they reported her missing. And
take your time.
Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, for us, it was shocking for so many reasons. One, yoga retreats are exactly what single women do to travel alone and to travel safely. And Taylor was in that teacher training with 14 other participants. And it's exactly the kind of place where she should have been safe. She was there, had been there for 2.5 weeks before she disappeared. So Taylor's mom, myself, and a few others went down to the Bahamas. And, what we found there was, to say disappointing is an understatement. The investigation was seriously lacking. It was almost as if they weren't even trying to find Taylor. We arrived and the police didn't have any missing persons flyers of Taylor up in their police center. We didn't see any missing flyers at all while we were on the island anywhere, including at Sivananda Ashram. There, we didn't see any missing persons flyers while we were there either. In fact, we had gotten reports from people who were going to that ashram, to Sivananda, after the week or two after Taylor had gone missing, and they actually canceled their stay because they learned through the media that Taylor had gone missing and they had not been informed by the ashram itself. So it was pretty horrifying to show up there and learn that, in fact, not much had been done by way of investigation. And the biggest development in the investigation was actually facilitated by Taylor's niece, who was able to ping the location of Taylor's phone and then send the location to the police in the Bahamas. And so, you amplifying Taylor's case when we're almost a year out from her disappearance matters a lot, in part because, the investigation led by the Royal Bahamian Police Force has not turned up any additional information since we were last there in June of last year. And so you can imagine, actually don't imagine. I don't want anyone to have to experience what we've experienced, because it's horrifying to have a loved one go missing. And then it is beyond infuriating to know that there is such a lack of will as well as a lack of capacity. Perhaps, I mean, these are things that one can only surmise, that it's a lack of will, that it's a lack of capacity to actually find, your person who you love so much. Right.
Right. Right. And I feel like that's very like gracious and compassionate to think of it as a lack of capacity, because um, the level of frustration, and I don't know what, if you can share what those experiences were like, navigating conversations with the police, navigating conversations with the ashram, and also, was there any involvement from like US authorities, since this person is US citizen, I'm assuming. What was that like, like figuring out where do you even begin, and how do you navigate something like this?
Mm-hmm. It's all woefully lacking, all of it, from every single party who you just mentioned. Um, I'll say this in general. No one knows what this feels like until they've experienced it. I consider myself a very empathetic person, and I care a lot about what happens to people who I don't know, or who I would never know.
Right.
But bad things happen to them. And to be in this kind of situation personally is unlike anything I could have ever imagined. So I'll say that. And there's, it's Taylor is my best friend, for 15 years. And I've described it to a lot of people, especially people who maybe aren't in social justice communities or aren't in queer communities. But like when you have someone, when you're not in a traditional heterosexual relationship, you're not married, right? You're not following these social conventions. It's like your best friend is your person. Taylor's my person. Taylor knows about everything that's happened in my life over the last 15 years. The person who knows me, sees me, and me, her, and so, I think about sometimes like some marriages don't last 15 years. Okay.
Yes.
So, and there's, from outsiders, right? Even when people think that they're being supportive, there's like this pressure to like be rational or be logical or, and when the situation is anything but, right? We dealing with the police in the Bahamas, there's like a bit of insistence that we should give them the benefit of the doubt that they're doing everything they can. When you look at a situation rationally, logically, absolutely not. No, you have not. That is an outrageous claim to say that. It was an outrageous claim to say that, less than a week after Taylor had gone missing, a day after Taylor had gone missing. It's seriously an outrageous claim to say that right now. And, to have to sit across a table from people who are insisting that they're doing everything they can to find your loved one when in fact they have not, it's infuriating. And I think I think goodness for like the strength of Taylor's mom, for my strength, for the strength of the other folks who have been working closely with us, because it would otherwise be crazy making. And people can see the details of the investigation and where it was lacking at the Find Taylor Casey page on Instagram, where there are the press releases that we put out documenting our trip and what we found when we arrived there. Um, and then to go to the Sivananda ashram and yoga retreat, where again, it's like, you just feel like there's no way that you could be telling us all of the information. Taylor, who we know and love, was with you all for 2.5 weeks and you all know nothing. Adults don't just disappear. Right. And they don't just disappear from a yoga retreat center on an island that's supposed to be safe, right? And their engagement since, I think, is really telling. They have done very little to assist in the investigation, to assist the family. You would think that an establishment, a business, especially like a yoga teacher training, that like kind of espouses spiritual retreat, transformation, right? You would think that they would express a little bit more care and concern for Taylor's whereabouts, some regret about her disappearance, and even check in with Taylor's loved ones. But that's not been the case. We arrived to, like, people weren't even, not even this, I mean, it's infuriating. Not even everyone who was staying at the ashram at the time of Taylor's disappearance was informed that Taylor had disappeared. So what does that say about how earnestly people were searching for Taylor? People who could have had information could have seen Taylor, right? They weren't even asked. They weren't even notified that something was wrong. And that's telling. And again, it's beyond infuriating, because it's saying, well, at a minimum, you did not do everything you could to find Taylor.
And and no concern even for the safety of the other people at the retreat. Like, if somebody disappears, one, you want information. Has anybody seen this person? And two, maybe there's something, like to warn other people, like, hey, be careful if you're, on the beach or whatever it is. And yeah, that makes my blood boil, these types of places that are supposedly so focused on like spiritual development and whatever,
and well-being,
ascension, or whatever, these words are. And you can't even, you're so focused on your money. And that's an assumption I'm making, but I'm just reading the signs, that they're so focused on their coin and their reputation, that you really don't care about the wellness and well-being of these people who are probably paying a lot of money to be there, and learn things. And so that's really, really awful.
It's awful. And, even when we were there, the police and the people at the ashram were telling us like that we couldn't disturb the other guests. We were not to talk to the other guests because we didn't want to disturb their vacation. So it's like, okay, we clearly see what the precedent is here, what's important to you all. And it's not finding Taylor.
Mm-hmm. How do you think identity played into this in terms of, racial, gender identity? I'm really curious what the makeup of like that kind of space is. And also, again, general attitudes towards, LGBTQ folks, in a Caribbean we look at here, but, in a Caribbean context, even if you're an American, right? Even if you still have that passport privilege, there's certain things that, don't, that still play into how you're being perceived and how you're being valued.
100%. Well, I'm going to talk about it, and I'm going to talk about the ashram, and then I'm going to talk about the police, and I'm going to talk about the Bahamas.
Yeah.
So starting with the ashram, Sivananda, we people who were staying at the retreat, who had gone through trainings at the retreat, reached out to us to say that they believe that because Taylor was Black and trans, that the people running the ashram were not dealing well with her. Some people who were at the retreat the same time that Taylor was there had said that they did not do a good job of integrating Taylor into the retreat. There's a very disturbing video from Taylor's time at the ashram. One of the things that they are to do in their training is to lead chants, like lead the class in chants.
Mm-hmm.
And so Taylor was up on stage leading the class in a chant. And then, we see this white woman come onto stage and kind of touch Taylor, like put her arms around Taylor and put her head on Taylor's shoulder. And Taylor recoils away.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's like, that's, a moment when Taylor was focused on leading the chant,
right.
Invested in the teacher training. And then someone capitalizes on a vulnerability when Taylor's not paying attention to them. Taylor's paying attention to what they're doing.
Right.
So we have real questions about what was happening at the at Sivananda Yoga Retreat Center while Taylor was there. And even just from seeing that video as a snippet,
yep.
right?
Yeah.
Because, they have, and of course they have shared nothing with us, right? They haven't shared the curriculum. They haven't, we haven't been able to, the actual participants who were in the yoga teacher training with Taylor have refused to talk to attorneys, have refused to talk to investigators, private investigators. And so that's a sign, why is this not an open conversation about what happened to Taylor and what was going on? And
you think they signed NDAs?
I don't know. I do not think that they signed NDAs.
Okay,
no,
I was just curious.
I don't think that they signed NDAs. I think there's been other influences and suggestions that have them not speaking.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, you were I cut you off, but I was just like, what? They're
just
yeah.
It's appalling.
Yeah.
It's appalling.
Yeah. Wow. I'm sorry, please continue.
So, I mean, absolutely. I think that, Taylor is a beautiful human being by any standard.
Yes.
And Taylor has a very magnetic personality. Taylor is, very, very charismatic, and people are drawn to Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that people were also very aware that, they could make Taylor vulnerable in ways. I think, just seeing that video of how they were treating Taylor there. So I think that Taylor, being Black and trans, played a role in her disappearance 100%. Mm-hmm. I also, when we think about the Bahamas, one can do internet research and find that they are, well known to be homophobic, that there's a lot of transphobia, and some of that I think is very much related to kind of a very traditional Christianity,
for sure,
right? And we also all know that when a young white woman goes missing, you can't get away from it on the news,
all day, every day.
And people come out of the woodwork to find this young woman. It's such a tragedy that she's gone missing, and so it's like all these resources pour out to find her, to figure out what happened.
Right.
And, we didn't get close to that kind of coverage. Like when we think about the Gabby Petito coverage, we didn't get close to that. But we got significant coverage, and I think we got, you know, more coverage. I know that we got more coverage and more respectful coverage than most trans women get.
Yes.
And that's because we worked for it. You know, we made sure that it happened. And also we did have, and we still do have, some really great partners in media who you know, understand the importance of covering these kinds of tragedies and harmful things when it happens to any human being, right?
Right.
And so because of that, we were able to get significant visibility. But there's no doubt in my mind that the investigation actually would have happened, and would have happened thoroughly, and would have happened with much more involvement of the US government, of the FBI, if Taylor had been a white woman.
Yes.
And that Taylor is Black and trans, there's no doubt in my mind that that has contributed to the disregard with which her disappearance has been treated by the authorities in the Bahamas, by not every US you know, representative, but certainly some of them, and certainly by the ashram. I think there's been some calculation, you know, in Taylor's disappearance, that Taylor is a Black trans woman, and you know, we know that these statistics globally, that Black trans women experience the most violence, and I think there was some calculation in that that's related to her disappearance. You know, I do not think that Taylor just wandered off the ashram and turned up missing. No, I mean, that's not even, that doesn't,
No.
it's not even logistically possible, right? So yeah, I mean, I think Taylor being Black and trans has everything to do with her disappearance, and the lack of investigation, and the lack of regard for finding her, and for finding out what's happened to her.
I'm like I'm like, how is this ashram still you know, operational? Like, I'm so mad. I'm like, hold on, you know, and then it's like, you know, nitty gritty questions of like, well, are they a US business, you know, operating in the Bahamas? Are they, you know, Bahamian business, or like, and that's, it's not irrelevant, but it's kind of, you know, besides the point. But because I'm sitting here like, you know what I mean? Like, what are these levers that we pull to, you know, put pressure on them, or not even put pressure on them? The rowdy person in me, the activist, is like, take them down. You know what I mean? And again, I don't know them, but just that, to me, to have that level of secrecy is so shady, and to not want to support or help in an investigation in any way is so sus. But also too, I'm wondering, how did you deal with US authorities? Like, you mentioned representatives. What were the things that you did on like stateside, and was there any recourse because it didn't happen in the US?
So a couple of things. Let me go back to the Sivananda organization. So there are more than 200 allegations of abuse for this, against the Sivananda organization. And there are a couple of like projects, you know, one in Canada and one, I think, in Australia, that are like actually tracking those allegations of abuse. Now, 2 Americans have mysteriously disappeared from that location in Paradise Island, in the Bahamas. There was one American, Wesley Bell, mysteriously disappeared about 10 years ago. And then now Taylor has mysteriously disappeared from that very location. And so there's some real problems. And, you know, Taylor had been taking classes. There's actually like a Sivananda like location here in Chicago, and that's where Taylor had been taking classes. And how Taylor found out about the the ashram, the Sivananda ashram in Paradise Island in the Bahamas. And so there are some real problems, some real questions about that organization. And, going back to this notion about like how these businesses function despite, these allegations of abuse, these mysterious disappearances. This location was endorsed by Goop, Gwyneth Paltrow's company, and they quietly, at some point withdrew their endorsement, their public endorsement, but there's serious money flowing behind these organizations. And so it is important that when people experience abuse or things like these disappearances happen, that people speak out about it to prevent more from happening.
That's right. That's right. And how did you deal with U.S. authorities?
It's not easy. I'll just be really honest about that. It's not easy. Starting with the embassy, right? Okay. U.S. embassies, this is why, talking a little bit about political education here, when you have an administration, a presidential administration that's trying to, cut all these services abroad and make it sound like they're unnecessary. Embassies abroad are incredibly important. Okay. And they should be serving Americans, with the utmost of commitment and respect. The embassy essentially for us, has been the link between, us and the police in the Bahamas.
Okay.
And that's the role that they should play. The U.S. should be able to leverage a good relationship with a country to encourage a country to do more to find a missing American.
Right.
That has not happened in our case. It should have. It still could happen, but it hasn't happened yet. Even to just get like the level of engagement and or responsiveness that we've gotten has taken an incredible amount of advocacy, an incredible amount of like just administrative follow-up in reaching out, right? Because, the thing is, Taylor's our loved one, Taylor's my best friend. Those people are doing their jobs, right? And we'll put that in air quotes, doing their jobs, right? And so it's not been easy. The FBI, they'll say things like, oh, well, this is outside of our jurisdiction because this happened in the Bahamas. Okay. But y'all found Hannah Kobayashi when she was in Mexico.
Right.
So tell me about that. Mexico's inside your jurisdiction? Right. Tell me about sovereignty then. Okay. So these are the things that they'll say, even in the DR.
Right.
I'm blanking on that young woman's name.
Right. With the recent case.
Right.
The woman who disappeared at the resort.
Right. Right. The county police department from where she lived in Virginia was all up in there. The FBI was involved, right? And that was right away. Okay. And let me be clear that that's what should happen. That's what should happen. That's how our local police should show up. That's how our federal police should show up. Right. And that's how they should show up for every American. Right. Not just, beautiful young white women or, beautiful young women of color who come from wealthy families. Right. That's how our police and that's how our government should show up for every American who's missing.
Yes. So what kinds of advice or, what are some of the lessons that you've learned about navigating navigating this case that you feel like would be helpful to, travelers and or people like, God forbid this happens to some, this is a thing that unfortunately is is something that happens. And, what kind of lessons or, wisdom can you share with folks who may have to navigate this or may be navigating it, and we just don't know?
Well, I think in general, I think we need to be a little bit more proactive about creating accountability. Okay. So it's
Mhm.
like, oh, has a government, um, you know, displayed that they do not have the capacity and or the will to find Black women when they go missing, when they were a visitor to their country, bringing their resources to their country? We all got to speak out about that,
Uh-huh.
because we all could be victim to that. And it's also about like pooling our economic power, right? Why are we going to spend thousands and thousands of dollars to be a tourist in another country and they could care less if we go missing?
That's right. That's right.
I mean, that's the way where we have to create accountability, and we have to build some power around that and get united around that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because these are places that are dependent on tourism. Um, you know, uh, DR, or Dominican Republic. I was watching a really excellent video, Tourism Lens with Lily on YouTube. She's a travel and culture journalist. Was just talking about the slow response from the Minister of Tourism, that it took like 10 days for the Minister of Tourism to say something about what happened to the young woman at the resort. And, for better or worse, a lot of these economies are primarily tourist based economies. And also, I think and this is something that I'm in conversations with a lot of other like Black folks in travel, Black, creators and business owners in travel, is the ways that people don't see our money and the money that we spend as travelers. And we spend like over $1 billion each year. So, if it's a situation where money talks, there's a lot of power in Black travel content creators. There's a lot of money moving around. And so, what that means, I'm grateful for you emphasizing that there is a role to play in terms of us, having like recognizing our political power, but also wielding it and using it. And I think organizing it um, in a way that's useful.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I would also say, normalizing the advocacy, because it was, really difficult to get Black influencers, Black celebrities to actually advocate for Taylor. And that's a problem, right? We
I
need
believe
to
it.
be able to advocate for one another.
Yes.
And especially when, governments don't do what they should do, you know? And, if we're not seeing this right now in the US, it might be a Black trans woman one day. It might be, a Black heterosexual man the next day. So, to think that like it's not going to impact you, that's not necessarily true. And even still, are we so individualistic that we can't even advocate for someone else who has experienced harm?
That's
That's
right.
a problem.
That's right. And to your point, there was, I think last year, maybe it was around the time of Taylor's disappearance, there were a couple of cases in Colombia there was a guy from New York or New Jersey, tri-state area, and a Black male traveler that all of a sudden ended up dead in his apartment or his Airbnb in Colombia, and I can't remember
I
exactly
remember
what
that.
it was.
I remember
And
that.
it was the same thing where the mom was like, so now I got to go down there and go get answers because the Colombian authorities weren't doing nothing. And the US authorities were dicking around or whatever they were doing. So, it's really a shame that so much impetus is put on the family to have to go do like CSI and CIS work to go down
Right.
and investigate when there's no like political will, there's no impetus for them to push. And I think, to your point, it's like if a Black person goes missing, and especially like a Black trans woman, they know that the states aren't coming to press them for it. So there's no pressure coming from up top. But again, to your point, if it was, a young white woman or a white woman, period, then the U.S. would be more likely to apply pressure. And in terms of what is thought of as like Americans who travel, a lot of these tourism boards and places prioritize, again, white travelers, white people, with the assumption that they're the ones that have the money. Um, and that's beyond a disservice. And I appreciate what you're saying about, um, creators and folks. And I think, again, it's an issue where people are afraid to mess up their money. And, I'm not going to sit here and judge people, but I am with you 100%, where it's like, your money ain't going to save you if something happens to you. You know what I'm saying? And like, and part of why Wonder Woman was created is because of wanting to be able to uplift places that are safer for Black and brown women and gender expansive, rather, people, non-binary, queer folks, because I mean, we see what's happening in the States, but in the world, like, there's certain places where a lot of, not just the laws, but the sentiment are not friendly for, LGBTQ folks. And also, and that how that intersects with, like, I might be going to a place that's primarily Black, but am I safe in my identity, right? Like, can I, kiss someone of the same gender as me, or can I hold hands, or whatever? There's just all these different layers, and I think it's a real blind spot that happens in the Black travel community. And again, it's not, I'm not saying that to be disrespectful, but it's something that I personally feel very passionate about creating more awareness and more solidarity. Um, and also for people who don't fit a, you know, typical gender binary, like more representation and expansiveness for that.
Yeah, yeah, and I so appreciate that because we need it, you know. And again, it's like like it's okay to advocate for human beings, you know. You don't need to agree or disagree with someone's identity, you know. Like
Yes.
it is okay to advocate for humans, and we need to see more of that.
We have to do that for each other. Like, I feel like it's an imperative, like you know, I will speak only for myself. I feel like that's part of my purpose.
Hmm.
Like seeing things that are unjust, um, you know, like I can't sit by and just accept that as, um, just as like status quo. Um, in terms of, other things that our listeners can do to support, to support you, right? Like, how can folks support you and Taylor's family? How can we amplify this case? How can we put pressure and amplify this, the issue with this ashram? And for me, when I thought about it, and I don't mean this flippantly, I mean this very seriously, I'm like, this is a Netflix doc in terms of like the misbehavior or like, whatever is happening with this ashram, especially if you said they're like global. There was that whole issue with the I'm gonna mess this up, so forgive me, but it was the oh, what is it? The hot yoga. And I'm
Oh,
blanking.
Bikram.
Yes, yes, yes. And you have these like, shady leaders or, abusive leaders or whatever. Um, and I don't know anything about this ashram. I'm again saying that, but if these are documented cases of abuse, that's a 200 is a pattern. Like, and if someone disappeared 10 years ago, do you know whatever happened with that case?
You know, it's hard to not knowing everything I know about how investigations happen in that context in the Bahamas, and then also in the context of that Sivananda ashram
Mm-hmm.
location. It's hard to trust, but what they said is that this young man went snorkeling and never returned, is what they eventually said. But like I said, knowing everything that I know, having dealt with the police in the Bahamas and with an investigation to a person who's disappeared, it's hard to trust that.
Yeah.
And also knowing everything I know about having dealt with that ashram, it's hard to trust that that's
Mhm.
actually what happened.
And it's interesting you say that because with the young woman in DR, they said that too. It was not snorkeling, but it was like, oh, they went swimming at night, like her with this young white guy from wherever he's from.
Minnesota.
Uh-huh. And that there's, a lot of mm, shadiness again with the way that went down in terms of things that he said and his um complaints about how he was treated uh by the police, even though he got to go home and he got like no one was he was upset, I think. And again, this is in the really really great rundown with Tourism Lens with Lily. It was like he was mad because he had to like eat alone or something. It was just like something like, sir, what are you talking about?
And
um
where is this young woman? What happened to her?
right.
Like,
Y'all just let the guy go and it's like, okay, well, we don't know, bye, and on to the next. you know
right,
and
right.
there's you know that's an issue even in the United States. Obviously, like folks go missing, particularly again, young women, and then you add the layer of women of color, black women, black trans women. The numbers are there, and then you add this international context, and it complicates things so much more. um, and then if you add other institutions that are protecting their money and reputation, you have various layers of gatekeeping. But I want to bring it back to how folks can support you, what we can do, again, the advocacy. How do we find more information? How can we amplify information about Taylor?
Yeah, thank you so much. The biggest way right now that people can support our work is by donating. This is the other thing is that this is incredibly expensive, right? We have to have attorneys here. We need to have attorneys in the Bahamas, private investigators. I mean, and now this is going on a year,
Right.
right? It's incredibly expensive. And so people can donate. To this work at Find Taylor Casey at that page on Instagram, and then go to the link in bio, and there's a, a, a crowdsourcing campaign there. So that's the number one way.
Great.
Like I mentioned, you can also find the press releases and get caught up on the details of Taylor's case. Also, sharing this podcast. There's lots of, other creators also did, a deep dive into Taylor's story,
Good.
Sharing that, talking about it. We don't want 1 year to pass without having found Taylor.
Right.
So, all of the amplification helps for people to advocate on their own platforms for the safety of Black trans women here and everywhere. Right. I mean, all of that matters so much. Advocating on your public platforms, advocating in your personal life. Don't let someone say something transphobic around you and think that it doesn't matter. No, speak up about that.
Ashe. Ashe.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, yes, yes. That's so important. Thank you so much for that. And especially now with everything, the sentiment in the United States, I'm thinking about the difference when the case started, the administration that we had, versus now, and how that may or may not impact, any sort of political will, or what kinds of pressure or attention. I'm so curious. Like, I know this is like kind of, I'm I'm so interested in process sometimes. So you were saying with like private investigators, like
Mm-hmm.
what's that been like? How did you find folks, and like what are they running up against? Do you feel like they're on your side, or like, I'm sure it's uh a lot to navigate. How did you even navigate that?
I'll say this as a general statement. Transphobia and anti-Blackness having consistent barriers throughout our efforts of trying to find Taylor. And that's with across the board. Um, uh, the biggest misconception about private investigators is that they're going to go in there and they're going to be, like Sherlock Holmes on your side.
Right.
And that's not necessarily how they work. Oftentimes private investigators are, kind of trying to make relationships with the police and so on and so forth. And it's like, well, that's not necessarily going to help you in a situation where the police aren't effectively, for whatever reason, doing their job, right? So, you know, people think that like private investigators are going to be this kind of miracle solution,
Totally.
and nah, not necessarily. Yeah,
Wow.
it's not what one would expect.
Wow. Yeah, I
Yeah.
really thought like, cool, like at least you got someone like an in on the, and again, it's probably because I watched, stupid TV shows or whatever we've been trained to believe about what a private investigator is going to do. And I appreciate you, bringing back up that it's really been the transphobia and anti-Blackness that have been the kind of umbrella barriers um, for justice and for getting information. Um, are there any, last thoughts that you have that you want to share with folks about, ways they can prepare themselves or, as travelers, um, or even just, if things like if find ourselves in a situation like this, how to navigate, because I feel like you've navigated this with such tenacity and such grace. Like there is clear how much
Mm-hmm.
love you have for Taylor. But also like I'm really in awe of you for how, like you continue to persist and you continue to be graceful, and very vulnerable and honest in terms of what you've been navigating. So I really like deeply commend you, and also want to like again think about how community can support, but also like how you've been able to take care of yourself.
Yeah, thank you for that, because this is, the hardest thing that I've ever done. And it's all grounded in my love for Taylor, you know. Um and you know, I I'm a spiritual person, so faith helps, all of that stuff, my faith community. I have some like really amazing people in my life, who have held me down throughout all of this, and without them I would not have been able to do what I've been able to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um Taylor's mom is a huge supportive strength, source of strength and support. Um and yeah, I love Tay so much. So it's, in some ways, it's so much is driven by that. When people talk about like love being powerful, like this is a powerful force.
Shay, Shay. Thank you so much, Emily. I'm just in deep gratitude for you and this conversation, and I will continue to support in the ways that I can. And I hope that the listeners too will, share this, not just share this podcast. Yes, please do. I'm going to link in the show notes how you can find, the website, find Taylor Casey, make sure you have the correct spelling, all of those things, so that we can continue to amplify this, because Taylor is all of us, and she's all of our friends in our family. Like she's people that we know, and love, and so she deserves our attention and care, and honor and respect. So I'm happy to share that information. I pray that, and I hope, and I ask very seriously that folks will follow through and share this information, and what you said so much about how we speak about Black trans women and trans people is, a big part of the work that needs to be done in honor of Taylor and in honor of love and justice. So I'm grateful for this conversation with you today.
Yeah, thank you, Janna. And I'm so grateful for you and all of your help in amplifying this.
Shay,
Thank you.
it's my honor and duty and pleasure. So thank you to all of the amazing folks who have tuned in and engaged with this. You have your action steps, your to-do list. And so, I pray that we continue to be in community together.